Shall we see a show of hands? How many of us remember the year 1961? Mario? Maria, if we were being honest? Do you remember that hit song from that year? Shall we sing it together, that hit song from 1961, Frank Purcell? I will follow him wherever he may go. Do you remember that? Made famous by which movie? Sister Act. That's where we heard it, right? There's something beautiful about that image of a song written about this love relationship, about a young lady who would follow her love anywhere he went. And Sister Act, remember that, with Whoopi Goldberg, singing that song with all the nuns now singing, not talking about following a boyfriend, but following whom? Jesus. Follow Jesus. And wherever Jesus goes, we follow. Where did Jesus go? That's what we celebrate today in this Feast of the Ascension. Christ has died, Christ rose, and then after Christ rose and came back to the earth, what happened after 40 days? 40 days later, as we sang in our opening hymn, a cloud received him from our sight. He ascended into heaven, giving us hope that where he has gone into heaven is where all of us too are going to be following him. Amen. I love the ancient church. The ancient church used the image of going through a curtain. That Christ passed through the curtain. The what? Think about this. The ancient temples, before we had churches like this, the ancient temples used to have a spot where, do you remember where the communion rail always was to sort of divide us from what was happening on the other side of the communion rail? For those of us who remember 1961, remember when we had to kneel at the communion rail and receive communion there? Boy, that was a flashback, huh? But that idea of the communion rail actually came from the ancient temples, which instead of a communion rail, they had a big curtain that covered that part of the church. And only one person could go through that curtain, and only once a year, and that person was the high priest. And so in the letter to the Hebrews, the author of the letter to the Hebrews says, Christ is the high priest and has gone through that curtain. Meaning, when Christ went into heaven, it was like the high priest going into the curtain. And in the same way that the high priest was now closer to God, who was believed to be on the other side of the curtain, Jesus was now in God's presence, sitting on God's right hand. Have you heard that? We say it every time we profess our faith on Sundays. Where is Christ now? Seated on God's right hand. On God's right hand. It reminds me of the story of the young boy who was so excited to learn about Jesus sitting on God's right hand that he went and ran into Sunday school one Sunday and was raising his hand and said, "Hey, teacher, do you know why God created the world with one hand?" I said, "Well, what?" The teacher had never heard this. That God created the world with one hand. Where is this child getting this, that God created the world with one hand? The boy said, of course God created the world with one hand. Because Jesus was sitting on God's right hand. Sitting on God's right hand? Okay. Moving on. But we who hope to follow Christ through that curtain, which is a great image, not only of what happens at death, because think about this for a moment, all of our loved ones who've gone before us, as Catholics, as Christians, we don't believe in death. Death is merely a curtain through which all of us one day pass to be in God's presence. Amen? And so even though we can't see what's on the other side of that curtain, we believe that all of our loved ones are rejoicing in God's presence. Amen? And if we are to follow Christ, not only do we follow Christ in death, going through that curtain and being closer to God, but how are we following Christ in life and being closer to God every day. Because isn't that what Jesus did? If we're really going to follow Christ, it's not just following Christ in death, it's doing what he did. Christ opened the curtain, if you will, and got closer to God every day. How are we getting closer to God every day? Or is it something that we simply do for an hour every Sunday? Think about this for a moment. That prayer is something that we can do, not just at church on Sunday. It's something that we can do anytime, anywhere. Amen? You could be sitting in your car driving, and Lord knows Austin has enough traffic to be driving in, where while you're driving, you could be communicating with God and reflecting on the marvels of this world and all the people who are in it. That is prayer from the chapel, from the church of your car. You could be engaged in one of your hobbies, like sewing or working on the car, and that could be just as prayerful a moment as coming to church. Amen. I love the sign that Terry Ann has in our parish office, right above the seat where she sits. It's a sign that says, it's better to be in a fishing boat thinking about God than to be in church thinking about fishing. Oh, think about that. That's pretty profound. Right? That even fishing and being in nature could be a time of acknowledging God and God's greatness. Whether we're gardening or mowing the lawn, again, time for us to be with God. If we were to just take out our AirPods or headphones and use that time in a different way. I'll never forget, I had a spiritual director 30 years ago. Yikes, I'm showing my age. 30 years ago, I had a spiritual director in St. Louis, Missouri, and I don't remember this nun's name, but all I remember is one sentence when we were talking about prayer, and she was asking me about my prayer life, was she made the observation that even in the shower, think about this for a moment, even in the shower could be a moment of prayer. Prayer is not simply being in a nook with a book and a vigil light, as Sister Teresa Kernke used to say. Prayer can be any time, any place. And it's in those moments of prayer that we find ourselves ascending with Christ. Amen? That we find ourselves going through the curtain and being closer to God for that time. Sisters and brothers, if we come back to Mass next Sunday, that'll be in 168 hours. It would be a shame if the only prayer that we did this week was here in the church during this hour, when there are 167 more hours after this before we see one another again. Follow me? Prayer, you might think of like eating. Would you think about going out of the church today and not eating again until you see me next Sunday? Well, of course not, Father. That's crazy. I have to eat like by mid-afternoon. I'll have to eat lunch after this. Shouldn't it be the same with our spirits? In the same way that we feed our bodies, we need to feed our spirits as well. Not just once a week, but we need to continue to nourish ourselves through prayer throughout the day, every day. How is that for a challenge? For those of us who follow Christ, it's not just following him in death to heaven, it's about following him every day. And the scriptures are filled with stories of how he went out and did what he did in the world, but then he pulled back and found some time to pray and to connect with God. And then he went out in the world and did what he did, and then he pulled back and paused and took time to pray. Sisters and brothers, I challenge us this week to find just a little more time to pray than we did last week, so that like Jesus, we can continue growing in our relationship with God and with all those people God puts us in this world with. Let us stand and